Hi, this is Dr. Mercola, and today I'm joined by Dr. Don Huber, who is an expert in an area of science that relates to GMOs, and it's going to help us understand some of the nasty insider tricks of what's going on with this GMO issue. And he's actually gotten quite a bit of notoriety for his expertise in this area. So welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Mercola.
I wonder if you can tell our viewers what your specific training is and how you came to attain this knowledge and information on this very specific area of GMO toxicity.
My area of training is soil-borne diseases, microbial ecology, and host-parasite relationships, so that in realizing that agriculture is a system, not just a bunch of little blocks that fit together, you have to understand how that system works and realize that any time we change one part of that system, we really change the interaction of all of those other components as they work together. And so each time we have a change, whether it's crop rotation or tillage or different fertility programs or herbicide interactions, we see those changes as they affect those components in the system. And so my research over the last 55 years has been devoted to looking at those changes and how we can change them and manage that system for more effective crop production, better disease control, and improved nutrition and safety of our food crops. So when we look at such a major change as you have in a genetic disruption from a genetically engineered process, as we understand it in our limited knowledge now, we see that there are opportunities and actual changes in all of those components as they fit into the agricultural system, from the plant, the physical environment, the dynamics of the biological environment, and of course our pests and diseases as they interact together. So those have been the areas of my research over time and brought me to this point.
And let's just go back a bit into your background. Now you currently live in Idaho, or were you raised in Idaho?
I moved to Idaho in high school with our family. We moved the dairy up from Arizona.
So your parents were dairy farmers?
Parents were dairy farmer, raised on a dairy farm. I was at the University of Idaho as a professor for 8 years before going to Purdue University, and we were there on staff as a professor for 35 years. And
what did you teach at Purdue?
I was plant pathology, soil microbiology, those microbial ecological interactions as they relate to plant disease.
And I'll just review my understanding, and you can modify that as we go along. But I suspect your expertise in this area is related to the fact that one of the major modifications that are done in GMO crops is, by Monsanto primarily, is to provide an herbicide resistance against a pesticide, the most common pesticide used in the U.S. and I suspect the world, which is Roundup, which is also a glyphosate pesticide, I believe. So as a result of that, they're able to essentially kill the weeds and more efficiently or cost effectively produce crops, and supposedly at a lower price. I mean, that's the working premise. That's a whole other issue whether or not that's true. But what I'd like you to comment on is how that introduction of that resistance, and which allows them to display massive amounts of this very toxic glyphosate pesticide into the environment, how that impacts the soil microbes. Because one wouldn't think that it would affect it, not necessarily because it's an herbicide, which is directed towards plants, not necessarily animals or bacteria even. But apparently it does, and I'd like you to elaborate on that, because you've found some really interesting observations.
Well, what you have to do is realize what an herbicide is, or most of our pesticides, that they're metal chelators. In other words, they're able to immobilize specific nutrients. And that's how they perform their function as a pesticide, is by immobilizing an essential nutrient that is required as kind of that key to for a specific enzyme.
Do they work on a variety of different mineral chelators, or there's one or more that they target specifically?
Most of our pesticides, herbicides, are quite specific. For instance, if you look at phenoxyprop or Tordon, those will be copper chelators. In other words, they're specific for a particular copper relationship. By chelator, we mean it's a compound that can grab on to another element and change its either solubility or its availability for that critical function that it has physiologically. So that we have those herbicides and pesticides that are quite specific for just a particular essential micronutrient like copper or zinc or iron or manganese. Glyphosate is very unique in that it was first patented as a chelator by Stauffer Chemical Company in 1964 because it could bind with any positively charged cation. And so if you look at the essential minerals for plants, you see calcium and magnesium, potassium, copper, iron, manganese, zinc, all of those other critical transition elements as well as structural components for the some of them. But you see that they're all cations. Now they have an anion that is associated with them, but it's the micronutrient that's a cation that is a transition element, or that element that really is critical for a particular enzyme function. So if you can chelate, and in that chelation process essentially immobilize that essential nutrient, you have provided an opportunity to either kill a weed or damage and kill an organism. So that any organism or any weed or plant that would have that particular requirement for that physiologic pathway with glyphosate, the shikimate pathway, then you have an opportunity to have a very effective herbicide. You have to realize, though, that mode of action is immobilizing a critical essential nutrient. Those nutrients aren't just required by the weed, but they're required by microorganisms. They're required by us for our own physiologic function. So if it's immobilized, it may be present if we do a regular test, but it's not necessarily physiologically available in the same efficiency that it would have been if it wasn't chelated with that glyphosate or other chemical chelator.
Yeah, for those who aren't familiar with a chelator, it just means it's complexing, and this when it's complex to these essential minerals, it essentially forms a barrier around it, which prevents whatever life form is seeking to utilize that element from utilizing it properly. So I'm wondering if it's an artifact or a side effect of glyphosate to affect the bacterial organisms in the soil that you're an expert at. Because this seems to be, it wasn't designed as part of it. It's just sort of a side effect that they hadn't anticipated. Does that seem to be the case?
Well, again, any organism that has those same physiologic pathways is going to be impacted the same. What you need to remember, though, in the genetic engineering process, there's nothing in the technology that does anything to the chemical that's applied. All it does is insert another gene that makes it possible for you to apply that chemical directly to the plant without damaging that particular plant. The glyphosate is still, even in that herbicide-tolerant plant, that Roundup-ready plant, the glyphosate is still having an impact on 25 or 26 other enzymes because it's also chelating or immobilizing critical micronutrients, those cations, that are required as the keys to turn on those physiologic engines that make that organism or that plant really function. So in the technology, in our genetically engineering technology, we do nothing to reduce the chelating ability. We only provide an alternative pathway for that plant to survive the application of this toxic chemical being applied to it.
Would it be fair to assume that because that plant doesn't have access to those critical nutrients, that other metabolic pathways are impaired, and as a result is not going to be able to provide the same type of nutrition to the end consumer who is consuming that plant?
Well, this is well documented, that the nutritional efficiency, just having that foreign gene inserted, reduces the capability of that plant to take up nutrients and to translocate nutrients. Then when you apply the chemical, you have a further compounding effect in reducing the efficiency of the plant, so that at rates as low as a ½ ounce per acre, 12 grams per acre, been demonstrated that you reduce the uptake and efficiency of iron by 50%, of manganese, critical for liver function and immune response, by 80%. But then when you look at translocation from roots to shoot, you also have a reduction in zinc, and all three of those critical elements of 80 to 90%. So greatly compromised nutritional efficiency, as well as the ability of that plant to accumulate and to store those nutrients for its own use, but also for us and for our animals' nutrition in that process.
Well, thank you for pointing that out, because my impression is that most people who even are moderately familiar with GMOs tend not to fully appreciate what you just said. And it's a really important concept, that somehow they think that when it's a genetically modified food, they're somehow magically more efficient. And they don't understand that this application of the pesticide has this complication on the plant itself, which impairs its own nutrition, but doesn't magically disappear. That pesticide is still loaded in the plant. So that not only are you getting a compromised plant from a nutritional quality perspective, but you're also getting toxic residues of the very herbicide that was used to provide supposedly a more efficient and more cost-effective plant. So that you're compromising your own health. And then there's this whole other component that you're getting the genetic modification itself, which is inserted into the gene, which has been shown in a number of animal studies to have complications such as decreased fertility. So it's just a panoply of problems.
You know, glyphosate, of course, very unique also in that it's systemic in the plant, so that it accumulates in those growth points.
So it's not just on the surface.
No, that's going to be within the plant. It's going to be in your
You can't wash it off.
No, it's going to be in your root tips, your shoot tips, your legume nodules, and in the food that we eat, because it's in those reproductive structures.
Wow.
That's where it accumulates. And the later it's applied, now that they're using glyphosate as ripening agents to kill the plant before, to kind of speed up that harvest process, the only place that it can go is right into the seed. Now about 20% of it, though, moves out of the roots. So it moves down out into the soil, where it has the same effect on many of those beneficial soil microorganisms that it has on weeds, because they have that same critical essential metabolic pathway. But our residue levels are increasing. Every time we have a new Roundup Ready crop approved, we also see an increase in tolerance levels in the crop.
Now, can you outline the major crops that are affected by glyphosate now, and any new ones that are in the pipeline that might hit the market soon?
Well, those that have been genetically engineered for herbicide tolerance, of course, are the major crops. You have corn, soybeans, canola, alfalfa.
Is corn have resistance to glyphosate? I thought it was it was the cotton that had the Bt toxin.
Yeah, well, you have cotton and corn with both Bt and Roundup Ready.
Oh, I didn't realize it did that.
Also with several other herbicides that they're now putting genes into. But
so it's in cotton and soy. I mean, cotton, corn, and soy.
Right.
All the major ones.
All the big ones there, and we've just approved our USDA just deregulated alfalfa, so that here you have a crop that's a perennial crop, a legume. You put glyphosate on it, you do two things. One is that you take out your nitrogen fixing efficiency because it's very toxic to the radiorhizobium and rhizobium that fix the atmospheric nitrogen, those organisms that are critical for that process. But again, as a systemic chelator for nutrients, it chelates the nickel that's required as the cofactor, as that key for that enzyme process, so it just turns it off. And so you may have a nodule, you may have even some bacteria present, even though they'll be at greatly reduced numbers, but you don't have the functional capability because all of that system's been disrupted. So alfalfa is our fourth most important economic crop, but by far the most important and nutritional feed for our herbivores, all of a sudden can very definitely be threatened, not just because of the direct effects of the glyphosate on those microorganisms, but then also because it predisposes and can make that plant very susceptible to some common diseases that are very effectively controlled. We see this with one that on corn. We haven't seen it on alfalfa because we haven't had the Roundup Ready out long enough. But we certainly see it on corn, where we have a sister organism with the Gauss's wilt, bacterial disease. And in that situation, we find that when you put the glyphosate on, it nullifies all of the genetic resistance that has, in the past, made that disease of almost no consequence to us. Very limited situation, very sporadic in any severity. Now we find it from coast to coast, east to west, from Mexico to Canada, and for 4 years now we've had a major epidemic in our major food production area in the Midwest, just from that disease that is a direct result of our genetic engineering process to reduce the genetic resistance and then the application of the herbicide that it was designed to tolerate. We just haven't done the research. We've assumed a safety based primarily on marketing potential rather than based on science in those decisions.
So I'm curious about your dialogue with the chief scientists over at the USDA about this topic, because it sounds like they were able to meet with you. You exchanged that, you wrote this letter expressing that you have yet at this point, which is right by Thanksgiving as we're doing this interview, yet to receive a response. But did it seem from your perspective that they were open to dialogue, or did they just take this information because they were doing the job and sweep the data under the carpet?
I think we had a good dialogue with them. Wasn't so much a dialogue as an opportunity for those of us that took the question or the concerns to them, an opportunity to share our concerns, and we had very excellent discussion in that process of what research was needed, where the holes are in the understanding, and what's happening. They indicated they would do some background investigation in that process. I'd hoped that they would do it as a result of the initial letter, and I did receive a call from Risk Management about 2 weeks after writing the letter, asking if I could provide details, because there wasn't anything in the letter. The letter was written to a politician, and I didn't want to disclose names of scientists or detail because of the retaliatory effect that we see with anyone researching this area can be either fired from their job or their program shut down, and that's just a real fact.
Well, that's a pretty amazing statement you just made. So I'm wondering if you could expand on it, if you'd be willing to, because there's an implication, suggestion that the industry is really funding a lot of the research that's going on in academic circles that are doing the peer-reviewed studies that we can use to either document, to document the safety of it or the lack of safety of it. But it appears that if someone voices dissent from this position, that they're squelched. And I wonder if you could expand on that.
Well, I think that's fairly well documented. All you have to do is look at the statement that 26 North Central entomologists wrote. These were the scientists who were set up as a regional project to determine the biosafety of genetically engineered crops. And as a point of frustration, perhaps, but they wanted to notify the EPA, in that which they did in that public document that they sent in. They asked that their names be withheld because all 26 of them said that their funding is dependent on industry support. But in that statement, they alerted the EPA to the fact that they were either denied access to the materials that they were appointed to determine safety of, or if they did the research, that they were prohibited from publishing it. And so the consequence was that the EPA has no objective science to base a regulatory decision on, because that science isn't either available or accessible to them, or the research hasn't been conducted on it because they're proprietary products that they're prohibited to evaluate.
So because of the patent, they would be breaking the law if they did research on this.
That's right.
How did they, is this through political lobbying? They created this structure, this crazy legal system that makes it illegal to evaluate something for human food safety?
Well, if you even read the technology agreement that the farmer has to sign, he can't even do research on his own farm to compare whether this product is better than another one without violating the terms of that technology agreement. So that it's essentially a closed system to guarantee success.
So I'm wondering from your view, from your perspective, as a veteran research scientist, as a insider in the industry, if this is a rigged system, and there really is no way around this because of the control that primarily Monsanto, but other industry leaders have been able to manipulate the system to essentially make it illegal to do research and limit the funding to do it. But they've essentially monopolized the whole regulatory process. So, I mean, that's from my perspective, it seems that way. So this is an important issue. I mean, because if we can't do it the way it was designed to be doing, then we have to do a workaround. So what's your take on it?
Well, certainly as a group of us that are working together on not only the new entity causing reproductive failure, but also some of these other increasing crop disease problems and situations. As we've tried to look at that, we've even obtained private funding and taken it to the experts in the area for specific diseases and tried to encourage them to work on it. And in the past, last year, they've been prohibited from working on it by their universities or department heads.
Even though they had private funding?
Even though there was outside funding for it. So that's one of the reasons why we needed that contact with the USDA officials in hopes that we could share the problems and the concerns with them, that they would recognize the serious nature of them, that we could obtain their support in using their resources for funding of individuals in the specialists, so that then we could overcome that barrier that there seems to be there for anyone working on genetically engineered crops that might indicate that they're not quite everything that they were cut out to be. And it's almost as though you have to belong to that religion if you're going to be able to do any research or publish your research. And
which obviously is highly biased and prejudiced and is not going to produce objective truth.
And so we're hoping, they've promised that they'll seriously consider grant proposals. Those are being written now to address the issues, and we're hoping that that indication that they gave us, that they would be more than willing to consider that financial support for that research. We're hoping that in a cooperative role that we can work together in the process. Certainly very critical for the new entity, as well as for just the mushrooming type of an effect that we're seeing on crop and animal production. And then you look at the tremendous increase in human diseases that can have a potential tie right directly back to either the chemical or the engineering process. It's critical that that research be done as quickly as possible, and we need that resource to do it. Private funds, again, aren't going to be able to do everything because there's just too much to be done.
Well, the extent of the funding, but also the prohibition by most of the centers that actually have the resources to do it. Are, even if you had, $1 billion to do a grant to do it, you're not going to be able to do it because the researchers will kick you out. I guess you could start your own lab and do it, but but that's not very likely. So I wonder if you can comment on this, these novel organisms that are having impact on the crop failures, or the entities.
Well, we're not sure what it is. It was first identified by veterinarians who were confronted with very high reproductive failure in animals. And this is in probably 1998 or 2000. It was a sporadic, kind of a limited situation. They thought initially that it might just be one of those bubbles that happens and never be able to really explain it. But it's continued to become increase in its severity. So that I received a call Monday, for instance, from a county extension educator indicating that he has a dairy that has 70% abortions. Well, you put that on top of 10 to 15% infertility to start with, and you're not going to have a dairy very long. Mm-hmm. In fact, a lot of our veterinarians are now becoming very concerned at the failure for being able to have replacement animals.
Quick question on the timing of this observation on veterinary medicine. Was it prior to the introduction of genetically modified alfalfa, which would seem to make this problem even worse?
No, we introduced our first genetically engineered crop in the States, 1995-96 period there, 1996, when Roundup Ready soybeans really took off. So 2 to 3 years after that you started seeing it, and there's typically a lag period for a lot of those things, so that would fit, but it's continued to increase and tracks fairly well with what we see with the increased usage of our genetically modified crops, and especially with the Roundup Ready or the BT traits.